Something that's just as important to understand as preservatives is pH when it comes to formulating cosmetics. It's because if the pH of your product is off, the preservative actually won't work because each preservative is only active in a certain pH level. So it's really important to understand the pH of your cosmetics, how to balance pH, how to use a pH meter, and everything pH related. So that's what this video is about. So here's what a pH graph looks like. 0 is the most acidic, 7 is neutral, being water. Water has a neutral pH, and then the most alkaline is 14. Our skin's pH is right around 5.5, so our skin's pretty acidic. So for the most part, most of our products need to be somewhere around the pH level of 5.5, but this can kind of depend on the ingredients you're using as well, because there are certain ingredients that are only stable in a specific pH level. So like I said, preservatives are pH sensitive, but preservatives have a big range of pH levels that they're active in. For example, Liquid Dermal Plus is active in a pH range between 3 to 8. So that's a pretty big range, and we can easily make that product that has Liquid Dermal Plus at a pH of 5.5 because it's stable in that pH level. But when it comes to other ingredients, for example, niacinamide, I guess it can vary depending on where you purchase your niacinamide, but the one that I purchased from Lotion Crafter has to be at a pH of 6. So that's a case where you would want your product to have a pH of 6 instead of 5.5. Also, things like alpha hydroxy acids and beta hydroxy acids work better in acidic pH levels. So those have to be in formulations with roughly around a pH of 4.0. That's what I always shoot for. But you can also go as low as 3.5, but I don't really recommend that just in case the pH drifts. So 4.0 is what I would recommend to shoot for with beta hydroxy acids and alpha hydroxy acids. So those are just a few examples as to why you would make a product not have a pH of 5.5. But for the most part, if your ingredient doesn't have to be in a specific pH level, then you want to shoot for around 5.5. But you can go as low as 4.5. Another thing I want to mention is that when you go to buy ingredients, each ingredient itself has a pH level. As you guys probably seen in my video all about making face washes, part 1, I talked about how each surfactant has a different pH level. So when you're going to formulate your cosmetics, you need to keep these pH levels in mind. So for example, cocoa glucoside has a pH of like 11.5. If you're adding that into your product, then you know you're going to have to lower the pH because that is way too high for the skin and will be drying and irritating. So the reason why pH is important is because if you are using products that have a high pH level, it can actually dry and irritate your skin. For example, soap. If you've ever noticed, it's a lot more drying on the skin compared to body washes, and that's because soap has a really alkaline pH. So that's why it's great to make sure your product's pH level reflects your skin's pH level. So there's a few different ways you can actually take the pH of your products. You can use a pH meter or you can use pH strips. If you're just a beginner and making pretty basic formulations, you're not working with alpha hydroxy acids, beta hydroxy acids, retinol, niacinamide, these really pH sensitive ingredients, then pH strips are totally fine. You can make basic products using pH strips. You just dip the strip right into the product and match the color with the little color graph that the pH strips come with, and you'll know exactly what the pH is, and you'll know if you need to raise or lower the pH. But if you're doing more advanced products, I recommend buying a pH meter. And honestly, even if you are a beginner, if you have the money, get a pH meter. I only recommend pH strips if you're tight on money and you can't really afford the pH meter, but if you can afford it, get the pH meter. Because with a pH meter, you can actually get a very accurate reading of what the pH level is. And something that I almost completely forgot to mention, if your product is anhydrous, oil-based, like body butters, body oils, facial oils, those actually don't have a pH. So oil-based products don't have a pH, but water-based products do. So this is why when you make body butters, body oils, facial oils, you don't have to worry about adjusting the pH because they don't have a pH. So I actually got a brand new pH meter. This is it. I'll link it down below. This was recommended to me by Lee Loves Cosmetics. I'll link her channel down below. But the reason I got this pH meter is because it can actually take the pH of creams. So any type of Fix Solutions. This older pH meter that I previously used, I'll link this down below too if you're interested in this one. This one can only read the pH of liquidy solutions, so you have a far more accurate pH reading using a pH meter like this. So I just received this in the mail today and I figured we'd set it up together. And when you receive your pH meter, make sure you read all of the directions, that way you know you're setting it up correctly. So the first thing they tell you to do when you receive your pH meter is to open up the battery cap, and you need to remove the battery insulating strip, which I already did that. And then it wants you to remove the cap from the bottom of the pH meter to expose the electrode glass surface, which is that right there. And they want you to first soak the electrode, which is this, in a pH solution of 4 for about 10 minutes. So let's do that. What I like to use as my pH solutions, actually like already dissolved pH solutions. You can also buy like a pH of 4 solution in a powder form, and then you dissolve it in some distilled water. But I like buying the ones that are already in the liquid state. That way I can just take a beaker and pour it right in, and I don't have to worry about dissolving anything. So it doesn't say to have this on or anything, so I'm just gonna go ahead and place it in there and then set a timer for 10 minutes and let it soak. So let's talk about all the other stuff it comes with. This is a strap to go around here. I'm not gonna use that. But this is what I mainly want to talk about. This is electrode filling solution. So this is essentially used to replace the electrode. The electrode is what helps read the pH, and electrodes don't last forever. So eventually you will have to replace it, and these are all the tools to do so. Obviously I've never done it before because this is a new pH meter, but in the directions it includes everything you need to know about refilling the electrode, and I won't be doing an example of that today because I don't need to refill my electrode. Once this has soaked for 10 minutes, we do want to calibrate the pH meter, because whenever you get a new pH meter, you need to calibrate it to make sure it's accurate. And even if it does say it comes calibrated, I still recommend recalibrating it. And you want to recalibrate it monthly at least, or if you're not using it very often, you're going to want to recalibrate it every time you go to use it. But I use mine pretty often, so I only recalibrate it about once a month, but that was the case with my old pH meter. I don't know about this pH meter. We'll have to see how well it does. So now we're ready to calibrate the pH meter since this is soaked for 10 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and take my 7 pH solution and add it into another 25 milliliter glass beaker. And then I always like to use a 50 milliliter glass beaker as my rinsing solution. And your rinsing solution is just some distilled water. So I'm gonna go ahead and dip this in my rinsing solution. And now let's calibrate it. So make sure your pH meter is on by clicking the on button, which is down here. And you first want to dip it into the 7 pH solution. And then you wanna go ahead and press cal. And it'll start flashing cal, and then it'll flash 7 repeatedly, and then it'll say end once it's finished. Then you can take it out, dip it into your rinsing solution. And if you guys can see right there, there's a little tiny circle with a 7 in it, and that'll show up when a calibration was successful. So it's successfully calibrated 7, and then after we calibrate 4, there'll be a little 4 there. And then dip it into the 4 pH calibrating solution, and then press cal. It'll show cal, and then it'll flash 4.0, and then it'll say end. And then now you can dip it back into your rinsing solution. And in the directions, it'll explain to you exactly how to calibrate it in case that didn't make sense to you. And it'll just tell you everything you need to know about this pH meter. So another thing I want to mention is the reason why we're only calibrating in a calibration solution of 4 and 7 is because all of the products that I make are acidic products. If you're making alkaline products, which I don't really see why you would be, you want to calibrate your pH meter in a pH solution of 7 and then a pH solution of 10. But since I work with acidic solutions, I do 7 and 4. But that's basically it to calibrating your pH meter. The next thing I want to talk about is storing your pH meter. So this is the cap, and I don't know how well it'll come up on camera, but there is like a little tiny sponge in there, and that sponge is meant to soak up liquid to keep your pH electrode damp, because that is how you will accurately store your pH meter. If not, it'll end up getting like crystals and stuff all over the pH meter, and then could end up ruining the electrode, so it needs to stay damp. And this pH meter specifically needs to be stored in a calibration solution of 4. So I'm gonna go ahead and pour a little bit of the 4 calibration solution into the cap. And after taking my pH meter out of the rinsing solution, I always just dry it off a little bit, and then just place your pH meter into your cup, and there you go. That's how you store it. And you will always want to keep it stored upright. How I store mine is I just take a glass beaker. This one actually has a crack in it, so I can't use it. And I just place it in here. It just chills like that, and that's how I store it to keep it upright. So now I want to show you guys how to actually take the pH, and specifically we're going to be taking the pH of a moisturizer. So like I said, this new pH meter here that I just unboxed, this can actually take the pH of thick creams without them being diluted. As opposed to my older pH meter, this actually can only take the pH of liquidy solutions. So you actually need to dilute down the cream in order to take the pH. But there is some controversy in the formulating community on if that's actually an accurate way of taking the pH, because as we discussed, water does have a pH of 7, so it's neutral. So when you add water to something, theoretically you would think, you know, the water would raise the pH. Some argue that it's not enough to raise the pH. I'm gonna test it out here to see what the results are. So in this beaker here, I have some of my moisturizer, and I'm gonna be using the pH meter that can measure thick creams for this one. And then over here, I'm going to dilute 10% of the cream in distilled water. So that means you need at least 1 gram of cream to 9 grams of distilled water. So put your cream in your beaker, add in some distilled water, and then you just want to mix the cream in until it has dissolved in the water. So now that the cream has been dissolved, and then we have our thick cream here, let's take the pH of both. And I'm gonna fill up this 100 milliliter beaker with some distilled water to rinse the pH meters. So I'm gonna let them sit for about a minute to let the pH adjust. So these have been sitting for a little over a minute now. And as you can see, there's a difference in about 0.3, 0.25 to be exact. And that's honestly kind of what I expected. I think some formulators will argue that this probably isn't like the best thing to do, especially since, you know, this isn't an accurate actual reading of the pH level as opposed to this one here, because obviously this one's diluted. So it's 0.25 pH over, but that's not really too much of a difference if you take that into consideration. When you're working with really pH sensitive ingredients like retinol and alpha hydroxy acids, beta hydroxy acids, this could be bad because just being 0.3 off can make all the difference in formulations like that. But for just normal formulations like this cream, it's not too big of a deal. Obviously, if you want the most accurate pH reading, you're going to want to go for this pH meter here. So I think the question is, do I think it's okay to dilute solutions to take the pH? Or do I recommend spending more money on an accurate pH meter to measure in thicker solutions? Personally, I recommend investing in a nice pH meter that can measure in thicker solutions. This pH meter was roughly 60. The more expensive one was like 120, and you'll save money buying the more expensive one rather than just buying this one and then later down the line wanting this one. Get this pH meter. This is the one I recommend. But yeah, you do what you think is best. Obviously, I can't tell you what to do. I recommend the more expensive pH meter. So now I want to show you guys how to make 2 different pH buffing solutions. We have the citric acid buffing solution. This is a solution of 50% citric acid and 50% distilled water. And this one is used to lower the pH of your products. And then we have a sodium hydroxide dilution. This is 10% sodium hydroxide diluted in 90% distilled water. And this buffer solution is used to raise the pH. So first I'm going to show you guys how to make the citric acid buffing solution, and this will help lower the pH. And I like to use this 4-ounce plastic bottle here. I always do a 100 gram solution for this buffing solution. And then I add on my funnel, and then I start by adding 50 grams of citric acid to it. And then you just want to add in 50 grams of distilled water. And then I just add on the cap and shake it up to help dissolve the citric acid. And eventually it will just run clear and just look like normal water. And what I always do is add on a little sticker with a date, so I remember when I made it. And you don't have to preserve these or anything. You can just store them in a dark cabinet. And once a month, just create a new buffer solution. Now I'm going to show you guys how to make the sodium hydroxide buffer solution, which will help raise the pH of your cosmetics. So this one's a little bit more tricky. What I always like to do is make roughly a 300 gram batch because I end up using a lot of this buffer solution in my products to raise the pH. So we are going to be working with sodium hydroxide, which is pretty dangerous, but I promise it's really easy once you get the hang of it. You want to make sure you're wearing gloves, safety goggles, and a mask. And you want to make sure you're doing this process in a well-ventilated room or outside. Preferably, I like doing it outside, but I got to do it inside on camera for you guys. So first, I like to weigh the sodium hydroxide in a little dish. And since we're making a 300-gram batch and we need 10% sodium hydroxide, I'm going to weigh out 30 grams of the sodium hydroxide. All right, set that to the side. And then you want to grab some kind of really thick plastic container. I'll put up here on the screen what kind of plastic you want to look for. You just want to make sure it's not going to break and it's super thick because this solution will heat up. And then I'm going to weigh out 270 grams of distilled water because we need 90% distilled water. So now you want to pour the sodium hydroxide into the water. Do not pour the water into the sodium hydroxide. Make sure you're always pouring the sodium hydroxide into the water. So pour it in and mix everything up, and you'll notice it'll start to get all foggy, it'll fizz, it'll start to heat up, and you just want it to chill until it returns to room temperature and the solution runs clear, and then you can store it in a container after that. So make sure you're wearing a mask at this part because you do not want to breathe in the fumes. So once the sodium hydroxide solution has completely cooled, you want to store it in some kind of plastic container. I'll put up on the screen what kind of plastic you want to look for. You want to make sure it's really hard and thick plastic. You don't want to store it in glass because the sodium hydroxide can actually eat at the glass and eventually it could shatter. In the past, I used to store it in glass, but I've been advised by you guys to store it in really thick plastic. And then you can go ahead and add this into your storage container. And then of course, add a little label with what it is, 10% sodium hydroxide, and then the date. Now, anytime you need to raise or lower the pH, you have your citric acid buffer solution that will lower the pH, and then your sodium hydroxide solution that will raise the pH. So now I want to show you guys how to actually check and balance the pH of a product. So this product actually already is pH balanced, but I'll show you guys how to take the pH anyways. So first, I always use a 50 to 100 milliliter beaker and add some distilled water to it, and this acts as a rinsing solution for the pH meter. Add the pH meter in, and then I have a 25 milliliter beaker, which is what I like to use to put my product in because I don't like putting the pH meter directly into the product just for sanitary purposes. So just add a little bit of the product into your beaker, just enough that it will actually cover the electrode of your pH meter. Dip your pH meter in and turn it on, and then let it sit until the numbers balance. And as you can see, the pH is 4.84, so I actually don't need to raise or lower the pH of this product because I've already lowered it. So if you want to raise the pH, you can use your sodium hydroxide solution, which typically the only time I use a sodium hydroxide solution to raise the pH is when I'm working with alpha hydroxy acids. If you haven't seen my glycolic acid toner video, my glycolic acid face wash video, I use a buffer solution in those videos. So I'll link those videos down below if you guys want to watch me actually using this in action. But anyways, if you want to raise the pH, what you want to do is just take a little pipette and then just add, I'd say a few drops at a time. I'd start with maybe 5 and then mix the drops into the product. And then what you would do is grab another 25 milliliter beaker, add in a few scoops of your product, and then take the pH again to see where you're at. And if you need to add more, you can always add more. But typically when I use sodium hydroxide solution as a buffer, I'm adding 20% of the buffer solution because, like I said, I normally use it only in alpha hydroxy acid products. And that's typically the only time you'll have to actually raise the pH of your products is when you're working with beta hydroxy acids or alpha hydroxy acids, at least in my experience. But there might be other cases out there where you might have to raise the pH when working with other ingredients. The one you'll typically be using most often is the citric acid buffing solution, which will help lower the pH. So again, this is used exactly the same way. Take a pipette and then add in, I always start with about 5 drops, and you add the 5 drops into your product, mix it in, and then you want to let the pH balance for about a minute before taking it again. And again, you will grab another 25 milliliter beaker. At least these are the beakers I like to use for my pH samples. Add in a few scoops and take the pH again to see where you're at, and then you can always add more drops until you get the desired pH level. The more you make a product, the more you'll know how much pH buffer to use. Every time I make my cloud jelly face mask, I know I need about 15 drops of my citric acid solution to get to my desired pH level. The first time you make a product, you may have to go back and forth a lot of taking the pH, adding in some buffing solution, taking the pH again. But once you make that product again, you'll have a better idea of how much of the buffer solution you need. So like when I make a product that is like 5% glycolic acid, I know I need 20% of my buffing solution, just from experience. So I hope that all made sense to you guys. If you're familiar with my videos, you've probably seen me raise and lower the pH of my products at the end of each of my recipe videos, so you're probably familiar with that. All right, so I hope you guys found that informative. I know there's a lot of information here. If you need to watch it again, feel free, because most likely you might have not understood it all. So go ahead and watch it again. Next time you watch it, take some notes maybe. That might help, you know? That's what I do. That's what makes things make sense to me. So yeah, sorry if this was a lot of information, but it's very important to understand when you're making cosmetics. So I will talk to you guys in my next video. So later. Stardust Bath & Body, Nature's Farm Girl, Kennedy's Essentials, Let's Blend, Wildflower, Heartfelt Beauty, KAJ Bath & Body, Blue Mint Soaps, Sol Air Label, Lenny's Beauty, Shark City Naturals, Ohana Lay, Danny Botanicals, Pimpy Girl, Brie Maquillage, Alchemy and Clay, Bible Belt Boutique, London Latris, Naturally Flawless, Facial Daily Rituals, Your Spiritual Midwife 333, ShopLevies.com, Paige Murray Hair Care, and Holistic Products by Black Soul. Also, I sell skincare products myself over on Etsy. I'll link my Etsy shop down below, along with all my patrons.
I'm stuck in the motions. I've been consumed by the wrath of time, like I'm frozen. I'm shattered in this life. It's still the path that I've chosen. Because I've had a vision, now I'm on a mission to find myself.